Fiona felt the heavy silver tray tremble slightly in her hands as the head waiter approached with a severe expression etched across his face. It was the third time that evening she had received a silent reprimand delivered solely through his piercing gaze and a sharply raised eyebrow. It was not easy working high-class catering events in the heart of Manhattan, especially when one came from a modest neighborhood in Queens and had zero prior experience dealing with the demanding New York elite. "The guests at table 7 have been waiting for their champagne for 4 minutes," the head waiter murmured, maintaining an utterly artificial smile for the wealthy attendees strolling past them in the grand ballroom. "And please remember, Miss Fiona, at this specific event, we strictly serve the esteemed guests from their left side." Fiona nodded quickly, nervously adjusting the stiff black bow tie of her pristine black and white uniform. The Atwood Foundation for Medical Research had hired the upscale catering company she worked for only 2 months ago, and she knew perfectly well that she could not afford to make any careless mistakes tonight. The generous payment from this single luxury event would practically cover her entire rent for the month. As she gracefully navigated her way toward table 7, carrying the heavy tray of sparkling champagne flutes, her eyes caught something highly unusual in the corner of the room. A little girl who appeared to be about 8 years old was wearing a beautiful turquoise dress decorated with delicate butterfly embroidery, sitting completely alone at a small side table. Her solitary presence would not have been entirely strange, except for the heartbreaking fact that absolutely nobody in the crowded room seemed to notice she existed. The sophisticated adults walked right past her, conversing loudly, laughing and gesturing animatedly, acting as if the quiet child were entirely invisible. Fiona carefully distributed the fragile crystal flutes at table 7, taking extra care to serve from the left side exactly as she had been strictly instructed. While she diligently continued her work, she kept observing the little girl out of the corner of her eye. There was something profoundly unique about the way the child looked around the enormous room, showing neither the sadness nor the sheer boredom one would normally expect from a young child trapped at a formal adult gathering. Instead, the little girl watched the crowd with a deeply peculiar attention, her bright blue eyes darting from face to face, almost as if she were desperately trying to decipher a complex secret code. When Fiona finally finished serving the beverages, protocol dictated she should have walked straight back to the busy kitchen to retrieve her next heavily loaded tray. Yet she felt inexplicably drawn toward the solitary girl's table, pulled by a strange invisible magnet that guided her footsteps. The young girl immediately noticed Fiona approaching and turned her head to face the waitress. Her deep blue eyes locked onto Fiona's face, but there was an absence of that typical silent communication that normally happens when two strangers make eye contact. The child studied Fiona's face with a fierce, unusual intensity, focusing intently on her mouth, and that was the exact moment Fiona finally understood the truth. The little girl was trying her hardest to read lips in a loud, chaotic environment. Years of growing up and communicating with her own deaf parents had taught Fiona how to instantly recognize these specific, subtle signs. Without a single second of hesitation, Fiona balanced the empty silver tray carefully under her arm, and using her newly freed hands, she began to communicate smoothly in American Sign Language. "Hello, how are you doing?" "My name is Fiona," she signed with a warm, genuine smile. The effect of her signed words was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly magical. The little girl's face lit up brilliantly, radiating joy, as if someone had just ignited a private sun deep inside her soul. Her beautiful blue eyes widened in pure shock and immense happiness, and her tiny hands immediately sprang into motion, responding with rapid, incredibly fluid signs. "You know how to talk to me. Nobody in this huge room knows how. My name is Chloe." Fiona smiled broadly, feeling a sudden overwhelming wave of warmth expanding in her chest. She intimately knew that profound sensation of relief when a person finally manages to communicate in a world that usually remains entirely silent to them. "It is a wonderful pleasure to meet you, Chloe." "Why are you sitting all alone in the corner?" Fiona asked through gentle, elegant hand gestures. Chloe wrinkled her little nose in an expression that perfectly blended deep frustration with quiet resignation, a look surprisingly mature for someone so young. "Nobody knows how to talk to me here because my father is too busy speaking with all these very important people. Everyone always assumes that I do not understand anything at all, simply because I cannot hear their voices." The raw, unfiltered sincerity of the child's response made Fiona feel a sharp, agonizing ache in her own heart. She knew exactly how terrible it felt to be constantly underestimated just because of a completely different method of communication. She had spent her entire childhood interpreting for her parents at various medical appointments, stressful parent-teacher meetings, and even during heated arguments with impatient neighbors. "I understand you perfectly," Fiona signed back gracefully, offering the little girl a look of deep, knowing complicity. "And I am willing to bet that you actually understand so much more than these people could ever possibly imagine." Chloe nodded her head vigorously, her tiny face breaking into the most genuine, beautiful smile Fiona had seen all evening. The girl was just about to sign another response when Fiona suddenly felt a looming presence standing right behind her back. Turning around swiftly, Fiona found the strict headwaiter glaring at her once again, this time his face wearing an expression that mixed genuine surprise with heavy, undeniable disapproval. "Miss Fiona, we have 10 tables waiting desperately for the next course to be served," he stated with a dripping false cordiality. "This highly paid job is certainly no place for your personal distractions." That specific word carried a heavy, insulting weight that Fiona comprehended immediately, knowing Chloe was not a distraction, but rather an esteemed guest being completely neglected by everyone. However, Fiona desperately needed this paycheck to survive the month. "Yes, sir. I am heading back right this second," she replied with forced, polite obedience. She quickly turned back to Chloe and signed rapidly. "I have to go back to work right now, but I promise I will return later." The immediate disappointment written across the little girl's face was painfully evident, but she bravely nodded with understanding. Fiona walked away briskly, acutely, feeling the intense weight of the child's gaze, following her every move across the massive, brightly lit ballroom. For the next hour, Fiona worked absolutely tirelessly, serving expensive drinks, clearing away empty glasses, and carrying heavy trays loaded with sophisticated appetizers. Throughout her entire shift, Fiona's eyes constantly searched the crowded room for Chloe, always finding the young girl sitting at the exact same table, observing the party's chaotic movement, with the peculiar, hyper-focused attention of those who inhabit a world completely devoid of sound. During one of her quick passes near Chloe's secluded area, Fiona noticed that the child was deeply engrossed in drawing something in a small leather-bound sketchbook. Frowning in intense concentration, the little girl would occasionally look up to carefully study the wealthy guests before diving back into her intricate artwork. It was during one of these rapid visual sweeps of the room that Fiona noticed a tall, handsome man observing her from afar. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit that undoubtedly cost more than her salary for 6 entire months. He was watching Fiona with a deeply disconcerting intensity, completely lacking the typical predatory gaze some wealthy men often directed toward young waitresses. Instead, his look was profoundly different, carrying a unique mixture of pure curiosity and genuine astonishment. Fiona quickly averted her eyes, suddenly feeling incredibly self-conscious under his intense scrutiny. She continued serving the guests, but the undeniable sensation of being closely watched stubbornly persisted. When she finally gathered enough courage to steal another glance in the mysterious man's direction, he had completely vanished into the sea of sophisticated partygoers. During a brief, chaotic interval between the main dinner service and the upcoming dessert course, Fiona managed to escape into the busy kitchen. Leaning heavily against a distant stainless steel counter, she let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Is this your very first time working an Atwood Foundation gala?" asked James, one of the oldest and most experienced waiters on the team, while he expertly arranged fresh crystal glasses onto a polished silver tray. "Yes, it is," Fiona replied softly, gratefully accepting the tall glass of ice water he handed over to her. "It is always this incredibly stressful." James laughed smoothly. "You honestly have not seen anything yet. Just wait until Mr. Atwood finally gives his big speech. Everyone in the room gets so tense, you would think the President of the United States was about to take the stage." "Mr. Atwood?" Fiona asked curiously, taking small, refreshing sips of her cold water. "George Atwood James," explained, dramatically speaking as if he were referring to royalty. "He is the sole owner of all this wealth, possessing one of the most massive fortunes in the entire country. Rumor has it he can buy and sell massive corporations before eating his breakfast purely for his own entertainment." Fiona nodded slowly, absorbing this grand information without showing much outward interest, having served enough celebrities and politicians to know they were all just people wearing expensive cologne. "Is he attending the gala tonight?" she asked, merely out of polite conversation. "Of course he is," James replied, leaning in closely, as if about to share a classified government secret. "He is that tall gentleman wearing the navy suit, chatting with the large group near the panoramic windows. They say he is a tragic widower raising his only young daughter completely by himself in a massive mansion." Fiona discreetly followed James's pointing gaze and instantly felt her stomach do a complete nervous flip. The handsome man who had been watching her so intently earlier was none other than George Atwood himself. And if he was indeed a widower with a young daughter, she had to ask, "Does his daughter happen to be a little girl, wearing a turquoise dress with butterflies?" she asked already, knowing the terrifying answer deep in her bones. James looked incredibly surprised by her specific knowledge. "Yes, that is little Chloe." How on earth did you know that Fiona chose not to answer his probing question? Her mind was rapidly processing the dangerous information. She had practically ignored all catering protocol to casually converse with the only daughter of the most powerful man in the entire building, the very same man who had clearly caught her in the act. "I really need to get back out to the main floor," she stated abruptly, placing her empty water glass down onto the cold metal counter. Upon returning to the brightly lit ballroom, her eyes instantly sought out Chloe, who was still sitting entirely alone at her table, now surrounded by several scattered pieces of drawing paper. The little girl looked up, and upon seeing Fiona, her sweet face illuminated instantly. Her tiny hands immediately began signing something with wild, uncontrollable enthusiasm. Fiona glanced around the room nervously, noting that the strict head waiter was currently occupied on the far opposite side of the hall, giving her a precious few minutes before the heavy dessert service commenced. She quickly walked over to Chloe's table. "What exactly are you drawing there?" Fiona signed smoothly, leaning down slightly to get a better look. Chloe eagerly pushed the scattered papers directly toward Fiona. "I am drawing all the different people at the party. Look, I even drew a picture of you." Fiona stared down at the graphite sketch. For an 8-year-old child, it was shockingly detailed and accurate, depicting a figure in a black and white uniform with dark hair tied in a neat bun, wearing a tremendously warm smile that Fiona never even realized she possessed. "It is absolutely beautiful," Fiona signed with total unwavering honesty. "You possess an incredible amount of artistic talent." "I simply like to observe people," Chloe explained through her rapid gestures. "When you cannot hear anything, they are saying you end up seeing so much more." This profound observation, coming from someone so incredibly young, took Fiona completely by surprise, revealing a hidden wisdom many grown adults severely lacked. "Does your father know how to use sign language?" Fiona asked gently, genuinely curious about how the isolated little girl communicated at home. A slight wave of utter discouragement washed over Chloe's expressive face. "He is trying his best to learn, but it is very difficult for him. He mostly relies on reading my lips and writing down many little notes for me to read. We have a professional interpreter at the house named Sarah who helps me, but she never comes to these late evening events." Fiona nodded with profound understanding. It was an all-too-familiar story she had seen before, the well-intentioned but ultimately insufficient effort resulting in a massive communicative gap that was never completely bridged. "You really do not like these big events, do you?" Fiona asked, her hands moving with graceful empathy. Chloe simply shrugged her small shoulders. "They are incredibly boring. Nobody ever talks to me, so I just sit here drawing all night long, but my dad insists it is very important for me to attend, so I do not stay hidden at home." Before Fiona could formulate a proper response, she felt that exact same heavy sensation of being closely watched. She slowly raised her eyes and saw George Atwood walking purposefully toward them. His confident steps were highly determined, and his handsome face wore an entirely unreadable expression. Fiona's very first instinct was to quickly step away and return to her demanding job before being severely reprimanded, but something vulnerable in Chloe's pleading eyes made her stand her ground. George stopped directly in front of the small table, his intense gaze shifting back and forth between his daughter and the young waitress. Up close, Fiona realized that he possessed the exact same shade of deep blue eyes as his daughter. There was an undeniable heavy tension in his broad shoulders, making him look as though he were constantly carrying a massive, invisible weight. "Chloe seems incredibly happy," he said, his deep voice much softer and gentler than Fiona had initially expected from a ruthless billionaire. "I honestly have not seen her smile like this at a public event in a very long time." Fiona swallowed hard, feeling incredibly uncertain about how to proceed. It was completely obvious that he had noticed their silent conversation. "I sincerely apologize if I inappropriately interrupted my assigned duties to speak with your daughter, sir," she responded with utmost formality, mentally bracing herself for a harsh complaint. George looked genuinely surprised by her deeply defensive tone. "Apologies. No, it is nothing like that at all." He hesitated briefly, acting as if he were struggling to find the absolute perfect words. "Actually, I simply wanted to express my deepest gratitude to you." Now, it was Fiona's turn to look completely shocked. George continued, speaking his voice, dropping to a much lower, intimate volume. "You clearly know fluent sign language based on what I have been quietly observing from across the room for the past hour." It was a definitive statement rather than a question, but Fiona nodded anyway. "Yes, I grew up with 2 deaf parents. American Sign Language was my absolute first language even before I learned how to speak English." A complex emotion flashed quickly across George's tired face, a raw mixture of genuine surprise and what heavily resembled profound relief. He looked down at Chloe, who was watching their exchange with sharp attention. "We are just talking about you," Fiona signed rapidly to Chloe, who immediately smiled back brightly. "Is my dad very angry with you?" the little girl signed in return, her face twisting into an expression of sudden deep concern. "No, he is just thanking me, because we were having a nice conversation," Fiona answered, acutely aware that George was watching their swift manual exchange with absolute total fascination. "What exactly did she just ask you?" George questioned the moment Fiona finally returned her full attention to him. "She wanted to know if you were terribly angry with me," Fiona answered with blunt honesty. A dark shadow of profound sadness immediately passed over George's handsome features. "She unfortunately always thinks I am angry or deeply disappointed," he murmured softly, seemingly speaking more to himself then to the waitress standing before him. Then, speaking in a much firmer, resolute voice, George requested, "Please tell her that I am absolutely not angry, but rather I am incredibly thrilled that she finally found someone lovely to talk to tonight." Fiona beautifully translated the heartfelt message, and Chloe's face lit up with joy once more. The little girl immediately began signing something entirely too fast for Fiona to politely interrupt and translate in real time. "She is enthusiastically saying that you should just hire me to work for you," Fiona translated smoothly. Feeling her own face grow hot with embarrassment at the child's boldness, "so that I can come to every single event, and she will never have to be bored again." George Atwood stood completely silent for several long seconds, his intense blue eyes studying Fiona with a piercing focus that forced her to quickly look away. There was something undeniably vulnerable about this incredibly powerful man that starkly contrasted with his pristine, intimidating appearance. "May I please ask for your full name?" he finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "Fiona Roberts, sir," she replied softly, nervously, adjusting her uncomfortable bow tie once more. She was painfully aware of the massive contrast between her cheap service uniform and his custom-tailored suit. George nodded slowly, looking exactly as if he were permanently memorizing her name in his mind. "Fiona, I will not take up any more of your valuable time right now, since you are clearly working, but I would very much like to speak with you after this event concludes about some potential professional opportunities." Fiona instantly felt a rising wave of deep, chilling discomfort wash over her body. She had unfortunately received highly questionable offers from wealthy men at luxury events, before always thinly disguised as professional opportunities. Her face must have clearly revealed her dark thoughts, because George immediately stepped back and added, "I am specifically speaking about hiring you to work as a professional interpreter for Chloe at large public events exactly like this one." The rapid clarification brought Fiona an immense wave of relief. "I completely understand now." "Yes, we can certainly speak after the event is over, sir." George looked deeply satisfied by her answer. He turned his attention back to Chloe, and using highly deliberate, visibly strenuous, and somewhat inaccurate hand movements, he attempted to sign a message. Fiona instantly recognized the immense painful effort of someone who was desperately trying to learn a brand new language as an adult. "I will be right back. Please stay here with Fiona for a little while." He somehow managed to communicate the thought, although Fiona mentally corrected his numerous execution errors. Chloe nodded happily, a very sweet, soft smile gracing her tiny face. "She is going to teach me how to properly draw human hands, because hands are incredibly difficult." Chloe signed back to him, her movements vastly more fluent and natural. George looked directly at Fiona with an expression that perfectly mixed desperate hope with heavy helplessness. "She answered me much too quickly." "What exactly did she say?" "She said that I am going to teach her how to draw hands because they are very tricky to get right," Fiona translated, feeling a strange, wonderful intimacy in acting as the essential communicative bridge between this powerful father and his isolated daughter. It had been exactly 3 long months since Fiona officially began working as a private interpreter for the Atwood family. Those transformative months had completely shifted the daily routines and deeply altered the lives of all 3 individuals involved in this unexpected, beautiful constellation. The bright Saturday sun cheerfully illuminated the sprawling gardens of the Atwood mansion, where a small but incredibly elegant 9th birthday party was currently taking place. Chloe, wearing a stunning sky blue dress and a shiny silver tiara, was happily running among the party guests with a newfound confidence that simply had not existed before Fiona's arrival. Fiona proudly watched the joyful scene from a strategic corner of the patio, remaining perfectly ready to step in whenever Chloe needed translation assistance. She felt an almost maternal pride seeing how magnificently the young girl had blossomed, Unlike the lonely, isolated child from the foundation gala, Chloe now interacted actively, using a clever combination of basic signs with her friends, careful lip reading with others, and a digital tablet for written communication with the older adults. She looks absolutely radiant today. George commented softly, having approached Fiona entirely silently from behind. I have never seen her look so incredibly comfortable and happy at a busy party. Fiona turned around, finding George dressed in relaxed casual attire. He wore tailored khaki trousers and a crisp white linen shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal his deeply tanned forearms. Over the past several weeks, Fiona had actively noticed a gradual, profound change in his overall demeanor. He displayed far less rigid formality, smiled much more frequently, and sometimes even sported a light stubble that beautifully softened his typically austere facial features. We did a truly excellent job preparing everyone beforehand, Fiona replied proudly. Printing those little explanatory cards on how to properly greet her using sign language was a completely brilliant idea. George smiled warmly, an expression that now appeared with delightful regularity. It was originally your brilliant idea which you perfectly refined and implemented, he countered smoothly, returning her bright, infectious smile as they watched the children play. There was a wonderfully growing ease between them, a deep, silent complicity constructed over many days of sharing the immense joys and occasional frustrations of building a solid communicative bridge for Chloe. Fiona tried very hard to keep their relationship strictly professional, but it was becoming incredibly difficult to ignore the powerful moments of personal connection that seemingly arose so naturally. Fiona Dad Chloe called out loudly, using her actual voice. It was one of the very few spoken words the little girl ever utilized, and she reserved it exclusively for people she trusted with her entire heart. The young girl sprinted over to them, signing rapidly with extreme excitement. You both need to come right now. It is finally time for the birthday cake, and I want both of you standing right next to me. Fiona translated automatically, though it was hardly necessary anymore. During the last few weeks, George had progressed phenomenally in his signing abilities, the direct result of intensive private lessons and relentless daily practice with Fiona and Chloe. Of course, my sweet princess, we are coming right now, George signed back to her. His hand movements were still not perfectly fluid, but they were vastly more precise and confident than they had been just 3 short months ago. Chloe happily grabbed both of their hands, eagerly pulling them toward the massive central table, where an elaborate 3-tiered chocolate cake waited beautifully decorated. Fiona clearly noticed the highly curious glances from the other adult guests, primarily the wealthy parents of Chloe's classmates and a few distant relatives. She knew exactly what they were silently whispering about, as her growing closeness to George had undoubtedly sparked endless high society speculation. Just ignore them completely, George murmured intimately near her ear, having clearly sensed her sudden rigid discomfort. People in our circle will always find a reason to talk. I just do not want to cause any terrible misunderstandings for your family, Fiona replied in a barely audible whisper. George hesitated for a fleeting moment, looking as if he were strongly considering saying something much more profound to her. Instead of speaking, he simply squeezed her hand very gently before finally letting it go. It was a remarkably brief, almost imperceptible gesture, yet it felt incredibly loaded with heavy, unspoken meaning. The cake celebration was deeply emotional. Instead of singing the traditional song, the guests eagerly followed the instructions on the cards, clapping their hands in a specific heavy rhythm, so Chloe could easily feel the loud vibrations. Simultaneously, the crowd used their hands to excitedly sign "Happy Birthday." Their synchronization was far from perfect, with many adults looking delightfully clumsy, but the massive collective effort illuminated Chloe's sweet face with absolute unadulterated joy. As the little girl took a deep breath to blow out her candles, George discreetly touched Fiona's wrist, leaning in close without ever taking his proud eyes off his beloved daughter. None of this beautiful happiness would have been remotely possible without you." He whispered so softly that only Fiona could possibly hear the words over the rhythmic clapping. Fiona felt a sudden intense heat spread wildly through her chest, experiencing an incredibly uncomfortable mixture of deep professional pride and a wildly blooming romantic affection she had been desperately trying to suppress for the past 2 months. Later that evening, when the vast majority of the wealthy guests had finally departed, and Chloe was happily playing with her new toys alongside the 3 close friends who had stayed for the exclusive slumber party, Fiona found herself standing entirely alone with George on the grand balcony overlooking the manicured gardens. The sun was slowly setting, painting the vast evening sky in breathtaking shades of deep orange and vibrant pink. Fiona allowed herself a quiet moment of deep contemplation, marveling at how drastically her entire universe had shifted in such an incredibly short amount of time. She still lived in her very modest apartment in Queens, and she still diligently attended her evening college classes, but absolutely everything else about her daily existence was entirely unrecognizable. "A penny for your deepest thoughts," George said smoothly, offering her a crystal glass of expensive wine. Fiona accepted the delicate glass with a soft, genuine smile. "I was simply reflecting on all these massive life changes." "Are you completely regretting taking this unusual job?" he asked carefully, leaning heavily against the ornate stone balustrade right beside her, standing so intimately close that their arms were practically brushing against one another in the cool evening breeze. "Not even for a single second," Fiona answered with pure honesty. "Chloe is an absolutely extraordinary child. Watching her bloom so wonderfully over these past few months has been the absolute greatest privilege of my life." "She absolutely adores you," George commented softly, staring deeply into the dark red liquid swirling gently inside his crystal glass. "Just the other day, she seriously asked me if you could simply move in and live with us permanently." Fiona felt her face flush, burning hot. "And what exactly did you tell her in response?" "That complicated adult relationships are incredibly difficult to explain," she asked, offering a small, incredibly nervous smile. "I told her that some very important questions simply do not have fast or easy answers," he replied steadily. The heavy silence that instantly followed his words carried the massive weight of countless unhad conversations and deep, unexpressed feelings that had been slowly growing between them. "George, I really do not think we should," Fiona started to say, but he interrupted her with a remarkably gentle tone. "We truly do not need to have this heavy conversation right now. Actually, I really wanted to show you something very special. Please come with me." He gently led her away from the balcony, walking through the darkening gardens until they reached the magnificent glass-walled art studio. In the exact center of the spacious room, carefully covered by a large white cloth, sat something that clearly appeared to be a massive canvas. Chloe has been secretly working on this huge project with the dedicated help of her private art teacher, George explained quietly. "She desperately wanted it to be a massive surprise for both of us. The teacher kindly showed it to me earlier this morning before the big party started." Fiona stepped closer, her heart beating wildly with intense curiosity. George carefully pulled the heavy cloth away, revealing an astoundingly sophisticated oil painting for a 9-year-old child. The beautiful subject matter instantly made Fiona gasp loudly, her hand flying up to cover her shocked mouth. It was a breathtaking, vibrant portrait of the 3 of them, George, Chloe, and Fiona, sitting happily together on the lush green grass of the garden. The painting technique was undeniably juvenile, but there was a powerful expressionistic quality in the bold brush strokes that perfectly captured their unique individual personalities. The absolute most impressive detail, however, was exactly how Chloe had carefully painted everyone's hands. Fiona's hands were explicitly forming the sign for teach. George's hands were clumsily forming learn, and Chloe's tiny hands right in the middle were perfectly forming the sign for family. "Oh my goodness," was absolutely all Fiona could manage to whisper, feeling hot, unexpected tears rapidly welling up in her eyes. "Did you happen to see what she carefully wrote down there in the bottom corner?" George asked, his voice thick with emotion. Fiona leaned in much closer to read the title written in Chloe's distinct, slightly messy handwriting, "My Brand New Family." George: I honestly do not know what to say. Life teaches us that the deepest connections are often forged in the most unexpected circumstances. As we journey through our years, we learn that true communication goes far beyond spoken words. It resides in the willingness of the heart to truly see and listen to another soul. Wealth, status, and background mean nothing when faced with the universal need for empathy and belonging. We discover that honoring the past does not mean closing the door to the future, but rather allowing love to expand and heal our hidden wounds. Real courage is found not in grand gestures, but in those quiet, patient moments where we choose to bridge the gap between different worlds. Ultimately, a family is not solely defined by bloodlines or legal documents, but by the conscious daily choice to hold each other's hands through the silence, proving that kindness is the most universal language of all.